Recorded. Welcome to the San Ramon Valley Democratic Club. My name is Brody Hilp. I serve as president. Our vice president, Rick Adler, is here, as well as our board member, Cecilia Manalga, our Zoom administrator. We're so glad that you join us. We are honored to have California State Controller Betty Yee here tonight. Also speaking will be Ali Saidi, Deputy Public Defender for Immigrants in Contra Costa County. And they'll speak in a few minutes, but first let us bask in the happiness of defeating the recall. Contra Costa County voted 71% for no on the recall. And I want to highlight a few of our members who did outstanding work to motivate Democrats to vote. Our member Cecilia Manalga worked 3 weeks on the campaign in charge of hiring up to 90 phone bankers. On 4 days of the week, she oversaw about 75 people each day who were phoning for the no on the recall. And many organizations had phone banks, including our County Democratic Party and both of our congressmen, Mark DeSaulnier and Eric Swalwell. We also thank our member Karen Beck, who for about 3 weeks was with our team for the banner display on the overpasses at the freeway. We went about 3 times a week, but in addition, she and her husband, Steve, went out many times by themselves to display the banner. That was our 27-foot banner that said, "Stop the recall, vote no." Not only helping with the banner displays, Rick Adler organized our important outreach to the Danville Farmers Market, where Karen Beck also helped. And thank you, Rick, for walking neighborhoods, placing our county's Democratic Party door hangers on more than 180 homes. Thank you to our club member, San Ramon City Council member Sabina Zaffer, and our Assembly member Rebecca Baracan for having a motivating kickoff event before we walked neighborhoods in San Ramon. Rebecca also introduced me to Jackie Smith, the head of Placer County Women's Democrats, who sent us instructions on how to make the banner. And thank you to Jan Weiss, who saw my post on Facebook, responded out of the blue, and had her group make a second banner, which they displayed at the overpass on Highway 24. For those of you who don't know, our banner was blue felt, 27 feet long by 4 feet high, with 2 feet letters saying, "Stop the recall, vote no." And I know there are many people I have not mentioned who helped with the campaign. Thank you to everyone who helped, whether you wrote postcards, made phone calls, did texting, or walked neighborhoods. We motivated the Democrats to vote. We defeated the recall. And guess what? After a relaxing break, we need to all get fired up again to make phone calls to keep Virginia blue. So sign up information is in chat and will be in our emails. I have an important announcement about Saturday, October 2nd. There are 3 events that day. Remember when the Women's March of Walnut Creek had that human banner event? We met at the park in Walnut Creek, and our human bodies lined up to spell "End Hate," while a helicopter overhead took a picture. The Women's March of Walnut Creek is doing the human banner again to affirm reproductive rights. So on Saturday, October 2nd, meeting at 8:30 a.m. and with a photo at 9:30 a.m. to spell pro-Roe. That's R-O-E, pro-Roe. And also on Saturday, October 2nd, there is a pro-Roe march in Danville. You just meet at the green in front of the Danville Library at 2 p.m. The third event is on October 2nd is the barbecue of the Democratic Party of Contra Costa County. It is at a park in Pleasant Hill from 1 to 4. Meet and talk with former Obama advisor and Democratic influencer and podcast host Dan Pfeiffer. He's really a lot of fun. The info's in chat. So I hope you can attend 1 or even 2 of these events. You can learn about all of these events and more in our SRVDC emails. The way to sign up for the emails is in chat. Also consider becoming a member. It is only $25 a year. Your dues make it possible for our club to donate to campaigns of local Democrats, primarily city council people. Our next focus is District Attorney Dinah Becton's re-election campaign in 2022. For her campaign in 2018, our club donated $1,000, and we hope to do the same this year. So look in chat for details about how to become a member of our club. And tonight, our first speaker is Betty Yee, our California State Controller. Betty is one of our club's favorite speakers because she has such a deep understanding of the issues, and she has ability to speak clearly and powerfully about them. And we're so happy that she could join us tonight. And did you know that Betty Yee is a native of San Francisco? She received her bachelor's degree in sociology from UC Berkeley, and she holds a master's degree in public administration. She was on the board of equalization and now currently serves as our controller, being elected in 2014 and again in 2018. As controller, she serves on the franchise tax board. She also serves on two boards, CalPERS, the California Public Employees Retirement System, and CalSTRS, the California State Teachers Retirement System. These two boards have a combined portfolio of more than $716 billion. Ms. Yee also serves on the CERES Board of Directors. That's CERES is CERES, a nonprofit organization working to mobilize many of the world's largest investors to advance global sustainability. Betty, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you, Brody, very much. And good evening, San Ramon Valley Democrats. And Brody, thank you so much for your leadership of this club, to Rich, Cecilia, everybody. Just really wonderful to join you tonight. And first, let me add my thanks and congratulations to the collective effort and everything that all of you did to defeat this recall. The resounding defeat means that I hope the Republicans have learned a lesson that the recall tool is not to be weaponized, to be employed at any level of our government, and to particularly dismantle leadership that we really need during this time. So just really thrilled about that. And I will say, as Democrats, it really was a victory for grassroots organizing and activism. Just everything you did on the phones, everything from phoning to texting to postcarding to canvassing, door to door. We know how to win elections, and it was just really, I think, an affirmation about the work that we're going to need to carry forward into 2022. So thank you all so very much. I'm happy to be back, and what I thought I'd do today is just to talk about just very, very briefly where we've been with the pandemic, to look at what's ahead for California, the financial condition of California, and then just do a little bit of a look ahead with respect to what we as Democrats, hopefully will keep the focus on in 2022. And what I want to say about California is, I think back to when we first learned about this pandemic and why it was called the novel coronavirus. And it was novel because nobody really knew much about it. And sure, to respond to this, I don't think any governor, any elected official signs up to lead during a time like this, but it was a time where we really did have to depend on the science and the information, the best information that we had to deal with this public health crisis. And I think Governor Newsom really did the best that he could with the information he had, and look at where California is now compared to the rest of the country. And so I just think about the ups and downs that we've had with this, but California really is doing well from a public health perspective. The Delta variant looks like it's at least some of the case numbers are declining. There are definitely some pockets of California that really indicate that we do have just such disparities still in terms of access to healthcare, in terms of services, certainly the particular communities that are most significantly affected. So it's one of those areas where I think this pandemic really, really unveiled how much we have to center so much of our work around equity and and justice, but also as we are making our investments of our financial resources to be very, very clear about where our greatest needs still are. So I'm really thrilled to talk about what's happening here in California. But it's a double-edged sword, because as your controller, I look at just how we've been able to really weather the fiscal condition of the state, and a lot of it having to do with the strong performance of the stock market, and really having the revenues that are coming in above our budget projections allow us the opportunity to make some critical investments, and also really the tremendous amount of federal assistance to states and to local governments as well. I shudder to think what would have happened had we had a continuation of the last administration in Washington, that there was just not a thought about getting those resources out to states quickly, to our local communities that have been really, truly the front line of this pandemic and the attendant economic impacts. And also looking at the same time, how we're going to start to build some resilience so that we are going to be able to build back, and to just know that we have an administration, as the governor likes to say, that is not an adversary, but really is a partner, and wants to help us really get back on our feet after a pretty significant crisis. So what I will say about California is this: we entered the pandemic with really strong fiscal footing. We had a rainy day fund that was fully funded. We had historic budget reserves. And when we entered the pandemic a year ago, March, it was because of those reserves that we were able to have pretty quick responses to what we needed to do. And we also knew that getting a major presidential emergency declaration was going to be key to get the FEMA dollars to start coming to California, so that we could stand up our emergency services. We could stand up all of the infrastructure to be able to get out to every community information, but also building capacity, knowing that this pandemic was going to be hitting so many of our communities severely, and the case numbers would be on the rise until we had some sense of how to curb those. So Governor Newsom immediately went to work to get that presidential emergency declaration, which did have the FEMA funds start flowing. And I have to say, as your controller, I was very happy, because I was not looking forward to having essentially 2.5 months left to figure out whether we would have enough cash to pay the bills for California before the end of the last fiscal year. And sure enough, we did, because of the FEMA dollars coming to California. We look at the stock market and how it continued to really perform, because our stay-at-home stocks, the Googles, Amazons, Apples, all of those were doing quite well, thanks to all of us who depended on them during the pandemic. But it also told the tale of two cities that became very stark here in California, and that is those who are earning the most did very well, and those who were in the low to middle income stratas of our economy were really suffering, and some continue to do so. And so while we were enjoying the riches of revenues exceeding projections coming in, and reversing, frankly, a lot of the cuts that we had to take in that last fiscal year to balance the budget, we were very happy that the revenues, coupled with the additional federal financial assistance, was so helpful to our budgetary situation and the investments that we were able to make. The other thing I will say too is that I think the Federal Reserve really learned a lesson since 2008, when we had the global economic crisis, the Great Recession, where they really wanted to be sure that they were doing everything possible to stand up the market, including huge mass buyouts and takeovers of government bonds, to really use that as the ability to spur the economy and to continue to have economic activity. And even recently, as this week, there's been some talk by the Federal Reserve that it might be time to pull some of that back. But that was a huge boon in terms of keeping the markets confident about the fact that we were not giving up on our economy, that was going to continue to have activity, even as millions of people were losing their jobs. And so we look at this, and I look back on this now, and I think how incredible that we had such quick, decisive action. How incredible it was that we had revenues come in exceeding projections, and how incredible that not only were we able to really get a handle on our COVID case numbers, but that even with the Delta variant, that we were able to get a good number of Californians vaccinated, to the point of where it could have been a much worse situation with respect to the variant. Now, I look at this year's budget, and It's been all about investment. And one thing I want to just use as a caveat to all of my comments is that when I think about these budgetary resources that come in above projections, when I think about the federal financial relief, I do think about these dollars as being mostly one-time in nature. The magnitude of them is great, but I think about relief as not being permanent solutions. And so really thinking about how to wisely invest those in areas that really are going to help build the economy back. And also how do we invest wisely in terms of just the long-term outlook for California, knowing that so many people have lost their jobs. There's been a lot of conversation, I'll address this in a moment, about the worker shortages that we see in so many of our communities, in many of our businesses, particularly our Main Street businesses who aren't able to hire as they have before, even with incentives to increase pay. And then also what this means relative to the larger issues at the macro level for inflation and interest rate increases. So I'll address some of that in a moment. But with respect to the budget for this current year, it is a budget to be proud of. I think we really saw some major investments that have been long overdue, and they're investments that actually speak to how we get this economy really churning again. Just the idea that we had historic levels of funding for education, restoring much of the cuts to higher education that had been taken last year, and then looking at finally funding and beginning to fund and phase in universal preschool, transitional kindergarten, after school programs. As you remember, former Governor Schwarzenegger was a big advocate of after school programs, but the dollars never followed. So to have a huge investment in after school programs, to look at how we're going to really contemplate our school campuses, our school sites to be more than just classrooms, but providing those services that our young people need with respect to social services, mental health services, the idea that now that every child who goes to public school can actually have access to food and dealing with the food insecurity issues. So these are the kinds of things that really have been, we think, transformative investments. The other areas of investment that I think have been critical, just critical, have been in the areas of housing and homelessness, as well as in childcare, because so much of this relates to just how people are going to feel a sense of stability so that they can be fully participating in the economy again. And so when we look at childcare, 200,000 new subsidized childcare slots, looking at how we're going to help childcare providers in terms of their livelihoods and being sure that they are really getting the support that they need to provide the services that so many of us depend on so that we can fully participate in the economy through work. And as we look at not just childcare providers, but what the governor did in terms of investing in just caregivers generally, how we're going to stand up a program where we are really looking at caregivers as having the potential to develop their careers so that they can continue to learn new skills. We pay them for what they are worth. And this is really in concert with the Biden administration's proposal to look at the care sector as something that is so important, what we call a work adjacent sector, that we can't have a thriving and fully performing economy without standing up the care sector that so many workers depend on so that they are able to go to work and have qualified people care for their loved ones. We also saw major investments in housing and homelessness, which continue to be a problem. We asked so many Californians, we asked every Californian to shelter in place, and for so many Californians, there was not a safe place to shelter nor an affordable place to shelter. And so now to see that we have $12 billion in total funding to help those who are unsheltered, to look at a whole range of innovations for those who are living without homes, to also look at how we accelerate some of the affordable housing initiatives, those projects that are ready to break ground to get those dollars out the door more quickly. And then also finishing up getting federal and state rental assistance funds out the door so that we can keep renters in their homes. It's been very, very critical as well. And I say all of this because so much of what we have asked Californians to do has been so destabilizing because we don't know what the future looks like. So many have lost jobs. And I just want to make one statement because I've been quite outraged at the fact that there are a lot of observers, mainly on the other side of the political spectrum, who are making careless statements about how workers are not returning to their jobs because unemployment benefits have essentially exceeded what they would make in a job. Maybe true, maybe not. But I think what this pandemic exposed for a lot of workers, and I think all of us can relate to this personally through people we know, family members we know, is that workers really were given a pause during the pandemic to think about what kind of work do they want to do? Are they being valued in the jobs that they've been working in? Are there other skills that they have to offer in terms of work in other sectors? And so we're seeing this a little bit of a mismatch in terms of the jobs that are available and those who are available to work. We also know that for the economy, especially when we see federal stimulus, particularly those like the Federal Reserve has been deploying, that the markets can really influence what we do for those who are highly skilled and highly paid. But for those who are less highly skilled and less highly paid, what we really need to do for those folks in our communities is direct investment, like what the governor did in the budget. And so really direct assistance, the Golden State stimulus payments, which my office is finishing processing, is about altogether $20 million and 20 million total payments. And I have to say, from a workload perspective, that's 20% above our entire workload from all of last year in terms of the number of payments we're issuing. But when all is said and done, 2 out of 3 Californians will receive a Golden State stimulus relief check. So 13 through electronic payments, 7 million through paper warrants, but a total $12 billion of assistance that is going back to working families and hopefully to help lessen just the burdens of daily life. So these are the kinds of things that we've invested in just to continue to give a boost to families, but obviously housing and homelessness, but particularly with the sunset of the various eviction moratoria is really key. And I think about housing in so many ways because for all of the dollars that we spend on, whether it's relief payments, whether it's job skills development or training, whether it's social services, mental health services, whatever the dollar is for people who are in crisis, if they are not housed, it just makes those dollars really ineffective because the stability is not there, the safety is not there, the dignity is not there. And so I think that is rightfully where we need to be focusing our attention. So as we looked at this recall, and I want to loop it back to the recall because so much of I think the pundits are going to say when they really do the evaluation of what happened during this recall, I think some have already kind of said it pretty casually that Larry Elder may have been the best gift to this recall. But what I do want to say about that is I felt, and I think probably some of you had this experience as well. It really felt good at the end, leading up to to election day, to talk about what people could vote for rather than what they were voting against. I think we were very clear. Democrats made a good case of just what the alternative meant. But voters really like voting for something. And the idea that we are taking care of our communities, that we are talking about housing, that we are taking care of our young people, that we are talking about caregivers, who so many of us know the work is so difficult. But to know that these are the kinds of investments that we're making during a time where we saw the Band-Aid ripped off of just how hard this work is and how many workers are vulnerable, that to me was a much more telling, credible argument for why to vote against the recall, because frankly, these are all things that are not valued by the other side of the aisle. And we also saw that, with respect to just what just took place in this budget, that they're having real tangible impacts right now in our communities. And so, people are, our young people are going back to school. People are getting vaccinated. And the stimulus checks are reaching, people's pockets. And so, just to have that real tangible impact, I think has really made a difference. And I hope that when we go into 2022, we take credit for that. We should take credit for that, but also to know that this is really a down payment on how we're going to rebuild this economy where we have equity really at the heart heart of everything that we do. So I'm just really proud of where California is right now. It's been a difficult last 18 months, but frankly, it's been a difficult last several decades because we've known these issues have been around for a long time, and the pandemic just accelerated our focused attention on it. So, and I would say that that has been the gift of the last 18 months. And also, as I look at the issues around 2022, we have been dovetailing a lot on what the federal government is doing, but obviously California, all eyes are always on California because we're always the first to innovate, the first to really lead on so many of these issues, and because we are one of the most diverse states. And the more that we can, really focus on how we are leaving no community untouched, how our investments are reaching, even the hard to serve communities. And one of the aspects that I'm actually really excited about, because it will be a very, very focused attention on how we center all of these activities and these policies around equity and justice. And that is California really leading the way on the national discussion on reparations. When we talk about, just all of the economic benefits that were to have been afforded with the rights that have been hard fought and won by our, excuse me, our Black American neighbors over the course of history, that this is an opportunity to actually talk about, how do we right those wrongs. And part of that discussion, I believe, is going to finally focus on some of these economic issues that have been difficult for everyone. To think that we had some of the most restrictive covenants that discriminated, that created housing discrimination in our own city of Berkeley, over the course of our history, that these were things that, right here in California, our government sanctioned, policies of discrimination. And I think when we start to peel that back and think about what our future looks like, that if we can have economic justice and certainly equity and economic justice paired together, and really understanding the history that we all have shared in this state and in this country, that I'm actually very hopeful about what this could look like. But it means that we as Democrats have to be sure that we are inclusive in terms of who we're involving to be part of our democracy, that as we are reaching out to our voters, that we are leaving no community behind as well, and that as we look at our elected leaders, that we are reaching into some of those communities to bring those lived experiences to represent us, on school boards, on city councils, on water districts, on just a whole myriad of decision-making bodies that really could help lift up this equity for all, and certainly a California for all that the governor has been talking about. I think about the long-term outlook for the state and also for the nation. And I will say that the Delta variant kind of threw certainly a wrench into just everybody's thinking about just how much progress we have been making with the COVID-19 virus. But due to the infections of the Delta variant, particularly hard hit in Los Angeles, no surprise, this week we saw the UCLA Anderson forecast cut its optimistic forecast in half. It estimated that in the second quarter, our annualized GDP would grow to around 11.1%, but the actual number actually is coming in at 6.6%. So similarly, it's reducing kind of the third quarter projections, and it's also in line with what we're seeing in terms of some of this slowing job recovery in the state. Now, the worker shortage issue is a real issue, and what we're going to see is a lot of really robust debate about the role of unions, in terms of helping to not just with building skills with workers, but also giving increasing worker voice, so that the types of things that we're seeing, including the bill that the governor just signed on regarding Amazon warehouses and these quotas that are demanded of workers in these warehouse environments, those are the kinds of things that I think, frankly, workers are just tired of being treated as non-humans. And I think that's not only in the warehouse and the logistics sector, but in so many sectors of our economy. So some slowing job recovery in the state. In August, our unemployment rate dropped by only 0.1% to, I don't have the most recent number, I think it's like about 7.4 maybe percent. But the recovery will continue to be in California much better than any other state. And it'll be fast recovery in the scientific and technical services field, as well as the information sector. And this is just really due to the demand for new technologies, for the new way of working and the new way of socializing, and certainly the new way of getting information out as a result of this pandemic we've just experienced. As we look at just what the recovery will mean in terms of residential construction. We think that the housing shortages will certainly drive the demand for new developments. But the question is, can we do better with respect to the timing of when we break ground on these new developments? And I know Assemblymember Grayson and I are working on a bill to try to shave off time on how we have the state approve financing for for new housing construction in the affordable housing space. So instead of multiple stops of approvals, we're trying to put all of the financing programs under one roof and have a single allocation committee to make a decision so that we can look at how all of these different financing options are working together. And that easily could shave off 2 years from the inception to when we actually have approval of a project that's ready to break ground. And then I want to say a little bit about the leisure and hospitality sector, because we all have experienced that. I think personally, this will be the last sector to recover. It is due to the depth of the decline in the sector during the pandemic, the reliance on international tourism. It was a global pandemic, so most everything was shut down, and the continued impact of the virus, not just here, but obviously in other parts of the world as well. So I would say that overall in the short term, say within the next year, the recovery is expected to continue at a positive rate, but albeit slower than initially predicted because of the resurgence of the COVID-19 and its various variant forms. Now, the long-term forecast, I would say over the next 3 to 5 years, the forecast is, I would say it's there's no crystal ball for this, but I think given everything we know, certainly revenues are going to continue to do somewhat well. We do expect that particularly if we get an infrastructure bill, that California will receive a huge infusion of federal dollars that will be putting many, many people to work. I think the access to capital has been relatively inexpensive because of low interest rates. And so that certainly has been a boon to economic activity. And the unprecedented amount of state and federal stimulus in the system supporting the economy. I can't understate this enough or overstate this enough. This has been something that I think the Fed really learned from 2008, quick decisive actions, but also Congress, understanding that as soon as we get dollars into people's pockets, you're going to see at the very least consumer spending, but also more than that, where you're just going to see a lot more participation, by people in various sectors of this economy. So I think those dollars are going to continue to be in place for the next 3 to 5 years if we invest them appropriately. As I said, relief is not a permanent solution, and I like to think about these funds as almost like an endowment, where you think about directing some to the most critical current needs, but also looking at how we hold on to some of those for long-term needs, and really beginning to be just better stewards of these dollars that don't come very often. So we have to be good stewards of them. We're going to see, unfortunately, housing prices continue to climb, and a lot of that just has to do with the increased demand, the supply constrained. The stock market, which has been at a historic high, obviously very positive to our California economy, particularly as it relates to capital gains revenue. But I think that in some ways, the delay of the infrastructure package may be helpful to us from a timing perspective, in that as we see some of the earlier stimulus funds come to an end, that we're going to get a new infusion of federal dollars. And so I think this is all very good. Now, there's a lot we don't know, and this is where I think all of us really remain vigilant. One thing we don't know is really the direction of this virus. Another variant could significantly slow or reverse our current recovery. We're not sure when international travel will resume at a robust level, which is particularly important to California, that's heavily dependent on travel and leisure and hospitality. And then the other thing that we don't know is, will automation take more jobs as employees are struggling to find as employers are struggling to find employees to fill vacant positions. It's something that we had not talked about, but certainly during the COVID crisis and the initial recovery, a lot of contactless, types of applications that were being put in place. Whether you're ordering through an iPad or just not really having that kind of interaction, will that become more of the norm? And I think there are definitely those in the tech sector who believe that that is going to quickly come upon us as a decision about whether that's the way we want to operate our businesses and certainly our personal lives. Now, I think all forecasters believe that California will recover faster than the rest of the nation. I don't think there's any dispute about that. Several of our current economic indicators seem to prove that to be, but our employment numbers are what remains stubborn. That we actually have more jobs than there are people unemployed, but I think there is a skills mismatch. I think people have fallen out of the labor market due to retirements and other decisions. And we also know that from a very personal level, as I mentioned earlier, workers are taking this time to reassess, just what is it that they want to do for a livelihood that affords them some dignity and respect. So when it comes to a forecast, I think we just have to ask one question, and that is the current strong economy real, or is it based on economic factors that are more illusionary? And I think the question is really, the jury's out on that. We are actually basing a lot of our projections on unprecedented state and federal stimulus and a very accommodating Federal Reserve due to the COVID crisis. So we've never experienced this before. And so being watchful is exactly what we should be doing, building budget resiliency, building up our reserves, fully funding the rainy day fund, which the governor and the legislature have done, is exactly what we should be doing. And being wise with the relief funds that we do have to have them meet our most critical current needs. And then I think certainly as the market is able to stand up all of this, one thing that we have to remember is that the only way that we can really be sure that our economy remains strong, robust, and healthy as we recover is if we really pay some attention to those who are not among the highest paid and among the highly skilled, because this really does take direct investment, as the legislature and the governor have demonstrated. So that will be really the debate going forward about how we utilize our resources. Should the market slow, I think we have the cushion of the federal funding in the next few years, but should the market slow, I know there will be a debate by some economists, particularly from the other side of the aisle, who believe that the economy has recovered enough to where it can generate its own activity and benefits for everyone. And that will be the subject of debate going forward. So, so let me just end by saying this. Going into 2022, I think the news is good. The question is, what do we do between this recall and going into 2022? And the answer to that is everything we know how to do about winning elections, and that is engaging voters. We don't stop it there. I think there's a lot to engage them about, particularly around some of these funding programs and certainly things they can be aware of. The state Democratic Party, my other hat on, as vice chair of the California Democratic Party, we're going to be looking to just engage voters on issues so that they know that we care about the issues that they care about, that they know that we are going to be advocating on issues with the legislature that they care about. And come time for the election, that this is not going to be a cold relationship, but that we have been organizing year round around these issues, educating our voters about these issues, engaging them, and really building that relationship of where when it comes time for the tough work to be done, that we're right back at it like we did to defeat the recall. So I'm really hopeful. And I have to say, Brody, you and Rich and everyone here, this club is one of my favorites to speak to because you all do the work. I have never any doubt about you all doing the work, but more importantly, you stay informed. And this is just such a great club to have had the speakers you had prior to our formal meeting, to know what's happening in the community, and to really know that this Democratic Club has a larger responsibility than just winning elections, but really about having a broad presence in the San Ramon Valley. So thank you for everything you're doing, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Oops, you're on mute, Betty.
Thank you so much. That was a lot of information. I still have a lot of questions, but I'll open it up for our audience. Do we?
Sure.
Will you raise your hand if you have questions? You can do that by going to the bottom of the screen and hit reaction. Rick, is that you? Or are you clapping? Okay, we have a question from Chris. Yes.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. This was really helpful and informative. I just wanted to ask about, obviously I spoke about climate earlier.
Yes.
So my question has to do with that.
Yes.
And, in a lot of, climate and finance circles, people are talking about, slower growth and green growth and even degrowth. And I just wanted to know if these conversations are happening in your office and what like a slower growth economy might mean for your goals for equity in the state and how we
Yes.
can make sure that that slower growth doesn't just go to the top.
No, that very good question. I appreciate the question. These conversations
Thank
are
you.
happening actually at all levels of our state government, Chris. And I apologize for not mentioning that. I've been so focused on getting payments out to people. I think that I'm just wanting to be sure people are getting, just some of the more emergent, types of assistance. Climate is is a high priority for this administration. It's a high priority for my office, particularly as we are working very, very hard through the two pension funds on the low carbon transition. We are very, very active in terms of looking at putting our assets across all of our asset classes at the pension funds into no to lower carbon solutions. And we're doing that globally with some of our partners across the globe. So that work continues. What I will say with respect to climate investments in California, the budget is full of them. My focus has been on issues around sea level rise and also looking at air quality issues, particularly affecting our low-income communities, because we saw the nexus of the disproportionate impact of the COVID crisis on particularly communities of color and communities of color that are living, whose members are living with chronic health conditions. And no surprise, if they're living in areas where the air quality is poor, we saw high rates of COVID infections in those areas. So I think if anything, there has been a very, very conscious and very aware approach to looking at this pandemic as it relates to how we look at the climate as almost the next pandemic. That the equity issues, the disproportionate impacts, the whole, just how we make our investments on the climate front are going to mirror what we experienced with respect to the COVID crisis. So, and it's not to minimize the COVID crisis, but it is to say we've been informed by it in a very, very real way. So, if you look at the Department of Finance has a great website, www.dof.ca.gov. They have the version of the budget that the governor signed on the website, and you'll see where a lot, and the budget summary as well, where the climate related investments have been made in this budget, and they're quite hefty.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. And thanks for all the climate finance stuff. The wildfire response has been especially impressive.
No, exactly. And I think, and one of the things you raised, Chris, is I think this whole issue of climate is so cross-cutting. And I will say you can't really talk about any other policy area. You can't talk about transportation without talking about climate. You can't talk about housing without talking about climate. You can't, I mean, it's really just so cross-cutting that I hope that as a state that we can be, just insisting that even like in budget hearings that we have, a discrete conversation and deliberation around climate impacts, just as you talked about prior to our meeting. Even locally, as local governments are looking at their general plan updates and amendments to be sure that we're talking about climate impacts in that regard as well.
Thank you. Chirag?
Yeah, I was waiting for Chris to complete. Hey, Betty.
Yes.
One of the question I do have is like a lot of these people, like I'm kind of being Republican at this moment. I'm not Republican by as such, but I hired a guy, and he just did not join the work because, and he kept insisting me that, can you pay me in cash? I said, sorry, I can't do that. and I don't know how to deal with it. He said like I'm taking some California, some aid or something. I don't know exactly which aid he was talking about. Is there a way that we can report these people like they just don't want to work and exactly the work they asked for it and I gave them the work and they just don't turn out to work? Is there a way we can report to the California department? Like, I mean, they don't qualify. They just are being lazy just because they don't
Mhm.
like it.
So these are people who are
Totally
going
unemployed.
after unemployment benefits and
on
yeah.
on the aid, I'm kind of being Republican at this moment.
No, I understand.
I'm kind of trying to address the issue that I have.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I was thinking like I should report him, right? Because he has a job and he just doesn't take it.
It's hard. It's hard. Here's what I would say. And did he work at a different job prior to the pandemic and now is, unemployed and looking for something different?
Very similar job. He qualified. He
Uh-huh.
cleared everything. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he posted, he said, I don't like the manager. So that doesn't work.
Yeah. I think there are a couple thoughts to that. I don't know the specific situation, but as I mentioned, this is a time where you're going to see a lot of worker empowerment because people are, employers are now very aware and sanguine about the fact that, workers really are going to have an elevated voice since the pandemic because they're in demand, right? And so, and some will use it for good change. Others will maybe not be so rightfully motivated. And I don't know how to regulate that. I think there has to be a larger discussion about what the expectation is of employers during this time. And
now, is there a way because this is like clearly somebody misusing the FTV.
I mean, yeah, I mean, you can, yeah, I mean, you can have, there's all kinds of kind of unintended consequences around this. You could report them, I suppose, to the Employment Development Department. I'm not sure what their enforcement shop looks like. If the delayed in benefits and paying eligible claimants has been any indication, I think they've been they're just overburdened at this point in time, so I'm not sure how much attention they will give to that.
I love people using a service, but I hate people.
Okay, Sharad, I think we've done that question a lot, and I think we should move on to Shirley. Thank you.
There was another question too, as for Betty.
Okay, are you calling me Brody?
Yes, I'm Shirley.
Okay. First of all, Controller, I'd like to thank you for your wonderful presentation. That was a lot of information. You said that we'll probably be in the forefront of the recovery. If the GOP in Congress decides to not raise the debt ceiling, which they've been threatening, how much will that impact us, and can we continue?
We can continue. I mean, I think this is, the Democrats have been wanting, obviously, the GOP to be part of that decision. But I don't believe it's a requirement that they support it. But would be great if they could just recognize that we have needs that we have to address and be part of the decision about raising the debt ceiling. But my understanding is that actions that are attendant to that can still proceed, but it just would be without the Republican vote on raising the ceiling.
Okay. Rick, do you have a question?
I do. Actually, Shirley asked one of the questions I had, but the other one, first of all, is do we have a final tabulation on how much the recall cost? And is there any discussion that you've heard in the legislature about making it difficult to spend all that kind of money on something that really didn't have much of a chance of passing in California?
Yes, no, thank you, Rick. The recall cost $276 million. Those were the checks that I did not like to write to our county elections officials, but it did cost us $276 million, which, as you know, during this time could have been directed to so many other needs. There has started to be a lot of conversation about potential recall reform. Nothing set in stone yet, but I know that Senator Glazer is leading, is one of the co-leads of those conversations, and but everything has been floated with respect to just what the criteria are for what would qualify, what would warrant a recall. Also looking at the signature threshold, raising that so that it's not so easy to qualify a recall. Having proponents of a recall, if they don't meet if the recall is not warranted, to actually pay for the costs of the recall. So there's been a number of things that have been advanced, and I think this is going to take a bit of time to actually deliberate. There's also been some thought about, that second question that was on the ballot that was problematic for people. We have a provision in the California Constitution that when the governor's office is vacated, the lieutenant governor succeeds and carries out the duties. So how do we actualize that and operationalize that to where the recall, should it occur, would just be about whether the governor gets removed from office or not. So taking away that second question so that we're not having essentially a separate and independent election that doesn't involve the officer being recalled.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ellis?
Thank you, Brody. Betty, to extend on Richard's question just now, one solution that's been suggested for the recalls is making it illegal to pay signature gatherers for petitions. If we did that, not only would it require that individuals like us go out and get petitions signed,
Right.
but right now, the only way you can get on the ballot is if you have a millionaire, a billionaire sugar daddy. I know this from Lakoff's campaign, where we didn't gather the number of signatures that we needed. But if we cut that off, not only wouldn't they be able to recall the governor or anybody else very easily, but as you know, our ballots have been filled with a bunch of garbage ballot measures that were only meant to draw people in. Things like requiring 14-year-olds to get permission to get an abortion. Nobody thought that that was going to pass, but that brought all the evangelicals into the polling booths. Anyway, what are your feelings about the legality of requiring that you can't pay signature gatherers to get your signatures?
Yeah, I mean, from my own personal perspective, I like that idea. I do think that has been explored previously, and there may have been some constitutional barriers to really getting us there. It's one of those, Ellis, that I would say, be careful what you wish for, because there may be an issue, depending on the issue. It may be that, Democrats are going to probably do better when we have this option available to us. So it's always hard, because these are things that really are great ideas, I think, from my perspective, because anytime you have the influence of money actually drive an outcome, I always think that is, not appropriate. But at the same time, when we're trying to really bring change to those who don't have the resources to really bring about that change, then, I mean, I know we're all activists and we get out there and work our hearts out, but sometimes we need that extra option and tool. So I think it's a more complicated process, but I do recall that there were some constitutional arguments, barriers to actually banning it altogether. And I don't recall off the top of my head, because it's not a new idea and it's been explored before, but I'll have to refresh my memory on that and try to get some information to Brody about that.
Thank you very much in regards to Stephen.
Yes.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Alice. Thanks, Sharon.
Happy circus.
Yes, you too.
I have a question. As progressives, we think that large funds such as CalSTRS perpetuates the fossil fuel industry because it will not divest from corporations that produce fossil fuels. And I know there's probably many, many people on the board of CalSTRS, but how does that going? I mean,
it's fine. So let me just say something about divestment. And I know it's a very heated topic. It's something that I deal with actually almost every day. We're a global institutional investor. And so I always think about, and by the way, we don't, as a matter of policy, divest, because we, as fiduciaries, we likely will get sued and we likely will lose, because part of our fiduciary duty is to have the duty to be sure that our portfolio is diversified. Now, it's not to say that we want these damaging companies to be in our portfolio. What we're actually trying to do is to get these companies to pay attention to what we expect of them. And we did that this year with Exxon by replacing 3 of their directors who are now going to be focused on how to move the company to the renewable world. Because they've been complaining all along that, this is going to take expertise. We don't have the technology. We don't have this. Well, I think those were all just excuses. And so we finally, as the largest pension funds, coupled with a number of other investors, were actually able to use our proxy vote to vote out 3 of their directors, put in 3 of our own. So it's going to change the course of the conversation. And the reason why we do that, Brody, is that if we were to divest tomorrow from Exxon, they're still doing business in the world. And then we've lost our ability to be at the table to actually really exercise our leverage about what we want the world to look like. And that's really an important point, because I think people have this sense that once we divest, this problem is solved. No, they're going to go to China. They're going to go to India. They're going to go to all parts of the world. And we have done nothing. And in fact, they've been empowered because we're out of the picture now. And they're going to continue with fossil fuel investments or continue to go even deeper in terms of their fossil fuel business. So we believe that this is the way to do it. We're also looking at how to minimize the risk of the transition. And part of why we want board members of these companies to understand how to look at risk is because we don't want to be saddled with the stranded assets that are going to be, somebody's going to have to foot the bill for those. So where I'm focusing my attention with the 2 pension funds and on the series board is looking at our financial regulators. Where are they moving capital and how are they moving capital? And hopefully it's away from fossil fuel investments. And by the way, we are asking banks also look at their own carbon footprint. Where are they investing? And then as well, to have eventually, my hope is once we are able to get companies on board with looking and articulating a transition plan, is to tie it then to their executive compensation, to tie it to their political activities, so they can't speak out of both sides of their mouth as far as being committed to moving to a green, renewable energy economy, and then also looking at what it means for their workers, that they are retraining their workers for the new energy economy as well. So this is all work in progress, and I think the 2 pension funds have been leading in that regard. But we are getting, and we welcome, frankly, the input that we get at every meeting as it relates to divestment. And I understand, believe me, I understand, for our young people who have known nothing but, the damage that fossil fuel have done to our planet, I get it. But we also know that if we lose our seat at the table to really insist that these companies make the change that need to happen, they're just going to go elsewhere around the globe. And it's not just oil and gas companies. What about airlines? What about other transportation, food processing? And I'm also very, very focused on not just oil and gas, but also water. I think water is going to become a huge issue around the world relative to supply and also quality, to where some of the water intensive industries really need to start paying attention to their water consumption. And we can certainly use the investors' voice on that to hopefully incentivize them to look at best practices, better practices.
So, that's really important too. Water, how do you see that that's going to work? They're just that they have better practices. I mean, if you take a gallon of water to make 1 almond, I mean.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think it's going to have to be about looking at, for example, we are doing a lot of work with our food processing companies now. So a lot of their operations could really be about water reuse rather than, looking at using, new water supplies. In California, as you know, we have severe groundwater issues. And so looking at how, and also being sure that we're not privatizing a lot of our water options as well. So desalination, I know, is a big focus of Wall Street right now. And that's something that, frankly, I'm kind of keeping a careful watch of, because yes, it will be an option that we'll need to think about in the long term, but until we have exhausted everything from reuse to conservation to, just all of the tools that have been part of our state water plan, I don't want to look at desalination that creates problems for our ocean health, and at the same time really have the most expensive water, the bills for the most expensive water being produced being on the shoulders of those who can least afford to pay it.
Okay. So California couldn't subsidize the desalination plants. They're very, very expensive. Is that correct?
It's very expensive, and it's actually the science still is not clear about what the long-term impacts will be on our ocean health, which we're going to be relying on our oceans for increased sources of energy, increased sources of food, certainly as a way that we do a lot of our research when it relates to sea level rise and climate change. And so we really depend on our oceans a lot.
Okay. Yeah. Any other questions? I have some. If this is sort of a long. Oh, Richard, do you have a question, Rick?
Well, yeah, I was curious, since you're in charge of disbursement and accountability of the funds on the high speed rail issue. I know we could get a big shot in the arm under Biden's infrastructure.
Yeah.
Do we have any idea when the first segment is scheduled to be completed? I know it's kind of frustrating because it takes so long to see tangible results.
Yes, it is frustrating. I don't know the date. There have been delays. I see the business plans every now and then. And by the way, I get requests all the time to look at auditing the High-Speed Rail Authority. The specific bond measure prohibits me from auditing the High-Speed Rail Authority. That's under the auspices of the state auditor. And so I would love nothing more than to be able to do that. Because the $10 billion that have been approved by the voters is really not sufficient. I think and we also have like a number of these business plans are getting more complicated because we're seeing a lot of local transit authorities and transportation agencies really weighing in on how high-speed rail is going to eventually, hook up with their service as well. So hard to know. I think the idea was that the Central Valley piece of this would be the first to be completed, but I don't recall what the most up-to-date date of completion is.
Thank you.
I have sort of a long question.
Okay, Brody.
In May of 2021, Governor Newsom announced $250 million allocated from federal stimulus funds to California ports to address revenue loss and bolster future economic activity. And so you serve on the State Lands Commission, which I assume governs ports, but I don't know.
Yes.
And as a progressive club, we're interested in addressing remedies for climate change. And I know two things about ports. First of all, the ships comes in and they're huge and they rely on diesel fuel. And then when they enter the ports, they're releasing a whole lot of pollution from their diesel engines. Are there any plans to change this? And then also there are proposals for wind turbines in the ocean for wind power.
Right.
But there's a great deal of infrastructure that's needed for the ports. I guess it's like 2 years of it before this can happen. So do you think any of that money will be going to either one of those projects, or what do you think?
So no, it's a great question, and I'm intimately familiar with this issue. So the ports are under the ports are the trustees of the State Lands Commission in terms of managing our tidelands and submerged lands. So we do a lot of work with the ports, and every port is different in California. So we obviously have the big shipping cargo ports in LA, Long Beach, Oakland. We have more of the not the non-container port, more kind of commercial port for other activities, fishing and the like in San Diego. We have small ports like Port Hueneme, Port of San Francisco, tourism, cruise ships, but also a lot of infrastructure for just a lot of the waterfront activities. And what I would say is this: so the money came to California as part of the federal American Rescue Plan funds, thanks to Speaker Pelosi for putting in some flexibility language in that act that allowed for an allocation of the state's portion of the ARP monies to go to those that are engaged in port activity. The State Lands Commission, I personally visited with each of the ports administrators, and the $250 million actually was a figure that was about what the ports needed just to remain whole. They had exhausted their required levels of reserve. Some of their bond debt service was in jeopardy. They were not getting revenues from the usual activity around port properties. So restaurants were closed, tourism was down, so they just weren't getting those revenue. And the activities, I mean, a lot of the staff some staff had retired. Some of the staff were working remotely, but because of the depressed business around the ports, there just was not a lot of activity happening. So the $250 million was essentially to keep them whole. Now, what does keeping them whole mean? It does mean that several of these ports do have initiatives to be more green. LA and Long Beach have green initiatives, and they're continuing to look at making progress on those. San Diego's been our research port. I've been doing a lot of work with them on developing sectors of the blue economy. So looking at things like just more marine friendly types of technologies, looking at research for new types of food sources, aquaculture and the like. And then we also have ports that are doing a lot of work as it relates to just being climate kind of centers for climate action. So whether it's for looking at like the wind power that you were talking about. So I want to talk about that in a moment. So this money was meant to essentially make the ports whole, to allow them to continue to bring enterprise activity back onto the Tidelands property. The monies that the administration did put in the budget were to be administered by the Governor's Office of Business Development, which really kind of blew us away, because the relationship, the agency that has the best relationship with the ports is the State Lands Commission. So we're in the process now of working through how those monies will be allocated with the administration. And we hope to get a resolution on that, hopefully within the next month, so that we can get those dollars out. And what we did say to the ports when I met with them was, look, you've got to do a better job of not idling, ships, out, so that they can dock quickly. We can get supplies on rail and get them going. You've got to be focused on the pollution aspects of that. And then they all actually acknowledge that. But we didn't want to condition this funding because they were in such precarious financial straits. But that conversation will continue to happen, because I know when I went to legislators to lobby for the $250 million, those were definitely some of the issues on their mind as well. Now, when it comes to wind energy, a couple of things. So San Diego, I think, has been one of the ports cited as a center for potential wind energy development and production. And wind is kind of an interesting phenomenon, because the science tells us that there aren't that many points along our California coast that actually are going to be able to sustain kind of a long-term supply of wind energy. Most of it is up in the Humboldt area in Northern California. Wind activity in San Diego is not something that anybody has looked at as a potential site for that. To the extent that port facilities can be helpful to these, we are going to look at how we harness, the ability to have the ports facilitate our activities in this arena. But the governor just signed a bill that requires the California Energy Commission to develop a plan for wind energy development in federal waters, because a lot of that is going to be supported by some of the federal funding that's coming out on renewable energy that then can inform us how we do this in state waters. And I think it's really important that we have the research to really inform us about where we get the biggest production, where we have the least environmental impact. And then also we're going to look at it from a broader economic perspective about what it means for jobs in local communities, and how we then look at the pacing of how we get this production and development and production up and running, so that we can look at how quickly we meet our 2045 goals.
Okay. Ooh, thank you. If we have questions in chat, can the person just raise their hand and ask it? Tina, would you like to ask your question?
I think she answered it just now. Thanks.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. Well, Betty, I want to ask you, are you up for re-election in 2022?
I am not. I am actually termed out. No,
Oh,
it will have been.
out. Oh,
it will have. It will have been 8 years, and it's been the privilege of a lifetime to be serving as a statewide constitutional officer, and with all of your support and the Board of Equalization prior to that. I am termed out at the end of 2022. I am pretty close to a decision not to run for anything. I just was recently elected as vice chair of the California Democratic Party. I'm very, very focused on that work to bring more diverse voices into the party, to do what I've just been talking about with all of you about reaching our communities that have not been touched and bringing them into the party, looking at where we can build leadership and a bench locally for all of our elected offices, and really centering the work of the party around equity and justice. And so I'm looking forward to doing that. And at the same time that I will be termed out, I will also be exploring the possibility of mounting the kind of campaign that I think I need and want to mount in running for governor. So I'm going to explore that. Yeah.
Ooh, wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your comments tonight. They were just wonderful. It was so good to have you speak, and we're thank you so much for coming to our meeting.
Thank you, Brody. I'm always happy to get an invitation, and I really do look forward to seeing all of you in person soon.
Yes.
Miss you all.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Of course. Take care, everyone.
Take care. Let's see. We have a second speaker that's going to be speaking. Let me get my notes up here. Our second speaker is Ali Saidi. He's an attorney with the Contra Costa County Public Defender's Office, where he serves as the county's first deputy public defender immigration attorney. And he's also the director of Stand Together Contra Costa, the county's new rapid response and immigration due process program. Mr. Saidi specializes in the intersection between immigration law and criminal law. He received his BA from the University of California, Berkeley, his JD from the University of Michigan Law School. He began his legal career at the Contra Costa County Public Defender's Office as a criminal defense attorney for several years, and then he went into private practice. He's represented immigrants in deportation and removal proceedings in immigration court, before the Board of Immigration Appeals, and before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Mr. Saidi has also taught criminal pretrial advocacy at UC Berkeley Law School. In 2015, he returned back to the Contra Costa County to be its first deputy public defender of immigrants. Thank you for being here, Ali.
Thank you, Brody. It's good to be back. I see some familiar faces. I haven't seen many of you for quite a while with everything that's going on, but it's a pleasure to be here. I have so much to talk about, so I'm just going to get right into it because I really want to get into a discussion with all of you because I think that's where the magic really happens. But I have about 20 minutes to cover a little bit of an update on some things, both relating to immigrant rights here in Contra Costa County and statewide, as well as racial justice in the criminal punishment system as well. So let me tell you a little bit more about myself because, when you hear these kind of bios, it sounds so, okay, he argued in this place and he taught there and it's very impersonal, but really, I think our lived experience is really a key part of what we do as people that are caring about our community. And so I want to share a little bit about myself. I was born in Iran. I'm an immigrant here in the United States. I actually grew up in Southern California, but I came to undergrad at Cal at UC Berkeley and loved the Bay Area ever since. And so it's been my home for, I won't say how long because it's gonna date me a little bit, but almost 30 years, I think, if not more. And I am not just an immigrant, but I'm also a progressive. I'm an anti-racist and I'm a Democrat. And I want to talk to you a little bit about our local systems a little bit, tell you some about our advances in immigrant rights and immigrant justice work that we're trying to move in the county, and the intersection of that with criminal justice, or what we call criminal justice, and the anti-racism work that we need to do. So I'm going to launch right into it. You know, as Brody mentioned, I work at the intersection of the criminal systems and the deportation systems in our country. And another way of framing that, if we want it to be even more accurate, is I work at the intersection of our mass incarceration system and our mass deportation system. And understanding both has really given me a insight and a lot of kind of passion for this work, because the systems share a lot in common, not just the fact that the mass incarceration system is the primary conduit to the mass deportation system, but also that the maneuvers and the systemic problems are very similar. And I believe that the solutions are similar as well. So, you know, as I became a public defender, as Brody said, you know, when you're young and you're just out of law school and you're just eager to get into court and get the fight, you know, it was very, very, it's a humbling experience to have your clients and their families depend on you to help steward them and represent them in a system that frankly is designed. It's not a broken system. It's a system that is designed to separate families. And, you know, we talk a lot about separating families in the mass deportation context, but we don't talk about it enough in the mass incarceration context, because that's the function of it as well. When you separate families, you inflict intergenerational trauma, and you also inflict intergenerational wealth disparities that continue to perpetuate our inequitable systems. So I was a public defender. I was doing my best. I was, you know, trying to do right by my clients. And I was successful enough that I continued to be promoted into different positions. So I worked deeply in our criminal juvenile delinquency system. So I saw firsthand what this system does to our youth, the vast majority of which, I don't want to just pull numbers out of nowhere, but I know it's over 70%. I will find you the statistic later. But I think it's something close to 80% of 75 to 80% of children that are in our mass, that are in our juvenile delinquency system have mental health, diagnosable mental health, DSM diagnoses. And yet what we do is we really do have our juvenile delinquency system as a mirror of our criminal punishment system, which basically locks away and punishes as opposed to heals and rehabilitates. And then I started doing felony trials and seeing the injustices of how the game is, frankly, and we can talk all night about this, but how the game is truly not fair, that it's really rigged at every level of the system to stack the deck toward prosecution and not toward rehabilitation and freedom for our predominantly Black and Latinx folks that are wrapped up into that system. So I was doing all of this work, and I'm going to be honest with you, it kind of it started getting to me. The moms, I mean, it wasn't just the clients and seeing what they were going through. It was seeing the impact on the families and entire communities that were traumatized time and time again, not just by the dehumanization of the system, but also by the fact that the system creates this deep separation of people from due process and justice. And so I started getting a little bit thinking, you know, the law in California around criminal law is really, especially when I was practicing, 3 strikes had just started, you know, 3 strikes law had just started and everything. And so you were seeing people go to prison for ridiculous amounts of time, including life sentences, for, having substance abuse or substance use disorders. And I decided that I wanted to go back to my first passion as an immigrant and try to see if I could also bring some due process to the immigration system. And when I became a deportation defense attorney, I was expecting it to be similar to criminal court, right? We all know kind of, we get a lie on television about what the criminal legal system is like. But I was still expecting that it would be something like I saw in court, where you have a judge that's supposedly, that's supposed to be independent, that it doesn't work for the same agency as the DA. You have the right to an appointed attorney if you cannot afford one. And you have the right to a trial by a jury, and you have a right to a speedy trial by a jury. The fact is, none of those things are the case in deportation court. Immigration court judges are not actually Article I judges. We all know about the Constitution and the 3 branches of government and the importance of separating the judiciary from the executive functions. But in deportation proceedings, the judges are basically just lawyers that are appointed by the Department of Homeland Security to adjudicate cases. Also, you don't have the right to a jury in deportation proceedings. That same magistrate or so-called judge makes the decision. So no jury. And most disturbingly, you don't have the right to a attorney to be paid for you by the government if you cannot afford one. So the fact is that over 70% of immigrants that are detained by ICE and are facing deportation proceedings do not have any representation whatsoever, despite the fact that on the other side is not only a judge that works for the Department of Homeland Security, but an attorney, a trained attorney with the Office of Immigration Litigation that works for that office. So I went in there and my mind was blown. I was like, what is going on here? This is nothing close to due process. I thought it was bad in the criminal system, and then I saw the deportation system and I was blown away. So I did my best in that context, and I learned how to do that. Because of my expertise in criminal law, I ended up specializing in deportation cases where the person was basically funneled from the mass deportation system. From the mass incarceration system to the mass deportation system. And that's really where I got my expertise. And then it really started bothering me. There's a theme through this, which is I'm one of these justice loving people where injustice just drives me crazy. And I've known some of you for a long time, and I know you're the same way. So I hope you can relate to that. So back many years ago now, it seems like a long time ago with the pandemic and everything that's happened, but back in about 2014, I realized that part of what was happening, the cases that I was seeing in immigration court, I was seeing that in the criminal system, the criminal defense lawyers didn't actually know what the immigration consequences would be for clients. And so they were inadvertently pleading clients or getting resolutions for cases, for example, for simple drug possession, that they didn't realize a simple drug possession charge could make a lawful permanent resident of the United States, that's someone who has a green card, lose their status and be deported from the United States. So I came back eventually to the public defender's office to become our first immigration attorney in the public defender's office here in Contra Costa County. Very exciting. We're one of very few counties that does that to this day. And we were one of the first to do that after Alameda County and San Francisco started their programs. Shortly thereafter, we did ours. Then as I was doing that, we learned that our probation office and our sheriff's department were up to no good with respect to collaboration with ICE. So what they were doing was clients that had completed their sentences. So they'd gone through the criminal system, they had resolved their case, they had done their time, and now they were on probation, okay, or they were on electronic detention at home. to be reunited with their families and reintegrated into the community as part of their rehabilitation. Well, what was happening is that the sheriff's office and probation was calling these individuals and saying, hey, John Smith, it's time for you to come for a checkup for your probation. You need to come to the office, right? And these individuals, trying to follow the rules of being reintegrated into the community, would go to these meetings, but lo and behold, it was a trap. And the trap was that ICE was there waiting for them, that they had arranged with probation in the sheriff's office to then take that person into ICE custody and put them into the deportation system. So what happened then was we started organizing right away to try to change those practices. And that's how the Contra Costa Immigrant Rights Alliance really was founded. So that is an immigrant rights coalition in Contra Costa County that's made up of organizations of immigrant rights activists, advocates, faith leaders and faith organizations, service organizations that serve immigrants. And we got together to try to stop those practices. And I'm happy to say that we did successfully stop those pretextual kind of sting operations that probation and the sheriff was doing. And then we worked together with the Racial Justice Coalition and many others to work on ending the ICE detention contract, because our community, our sheriff was basically having a contract with ICE to house immigrant detainees. We eventually got that shut down. And it was really important for us from the beginning to recognize the intersectionality between these two systems, that immigrant rights cannot be divorced from racial justice and the struggle for Black liberation, that those fights are one and the same. And so as part of that, we really focused on ensuring that the clients that we were seeing that were being processed through the mass incarceration system would at least have access to basic due process when they were transferred over to the mass deportation system. And so that's how Stand Together Contra Costa started, which I'm the director of. We provide free, no-cost deportation defense services for immigrants in Contra Costa County who are facing deportation. As I mentioned before, the government has not yet recognized that as a due process right like we have in the criminal system. And it's important to remember that public defenders nationally only really got created in the late 60s with a case called Gideon. Before that, the government didn't recognize the due process right, and now they have. So that's something we're working toward. And I'm happy to say that the program is doing amazing work. We're keeping families together. We're doing a lot of work for asylum seekers. Right now, I'm actually working as one of the co-leads for the advocacy team. We have a coalition of folks for the Afghan refugees that are coming due to the situation in Afghanistan. We're working on all of that. And we also at Stand Together Contra Costa, we understand the importance of working with community. And so it's not just a government program, even though it is operated out of my office at the Public Defender's Office. We have partnerships with many local nonprofits. For example, Jewish Family and Community Services, the Immigration Institute of the Bay Area Community Resources, and others, where we basically fund those organizations to really be engaged in the community, not only to provide these legal services, but to provide community education and outreach, so that not only are we letting people know what their rights are in the system and so forth, but we're also getting on the ground information back from our community about what they need. So that is the Stand Together Contra Costa side, but then the Contra Costa Immigrant Rights Alliance is still going forward. And what we really recognized, again, was that intersectionality with anti-racism work and equity work was really, really important. And that there has been, unfortunately, in the past, a history of anti-Blackness in the immigrant rights movement. And we're working very, very hard to change that. And that's a core principle of the Contra Costa Immigrant Rights Alliance, to not do that. So when we see things like what's going on with Haitian asylum seekers down in Texas right now, we stand up and we act. We're supporting UndocuBlack, which is a great organization of undocumented Black immigrants who do advocacy nationwide. Because just like every other system, Black immigrants are treated worse than other immigrants in the total oppression of immigrants in our system. And so we're working to ensure that the flights that were authorized under, things that Trump did, but that Biden is continuing to do, that the flights stop, that humanitarian parole is granted for the asylum seekers, for the Haitian asylum seekers, and that we have a robust oversight and services, including legal services, to help appropriately process those cases, as is the United States obligations under many treaties that we have internationally, including the International Refugee Convention. So in doing this intersectional work, we are part of another organization that I want to talk to you about because I think it would be very interesting to get your take on it. We, along with the Racial Justice Coalition, with Lift Up Contra Costa, with Conscious Contra Costa, I see Veronica Benjamin here, as well as Multi-Faith Action Committee, Standing Up for Racial Justice, and many, many other organizations and groups, created a campaign called the Reimagine Public Safety Contra Costa campaign. This campaign really started in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. You can see in my background, this is an image from the Black Lives Matter demonstration that we had in downtown Martinez in July of last year. It was a really, really powerful event. And so this Reimagine Public Safety Contra Costa campaign is really about taking an anti-racist lens to systems change that isn't simply about culture change, right? We see systems change as structurally based. And so justice reinvestment work, which has been actually happening in our community for a long time, led by trailblazers like Tamisha Walker from the Safe Return Project and many others. Justice reinvestment has been a call from the community for a long time. But with the political climate after the uprisings and after the murder of George Floyd, and the list goes on, Breonna Taylor, Miles Hall, many, many more, including many in the San Ramon Valley, including Tyrell Wilson and Mr. Arboleda. These things keep happening. And what we were looking at as the Reimagine Public Safety frame is it's not enough to change people's perceptions and ideas about race, right? That's good. That's a long-term project. But what we want to do is we want to look structurally at systems and policies that have disparate, inequitable outcomes, generally based on race, but all disparate outcomes, and look at what the investments are that we're making with our public dollars into those systems, and then evaluating those systems on whether or not, first of all, are they having negative, disparate racial outcomes? And second of all, are they even doing the work that they were intended to do? So I'm going to try to wrap up here so we can have a longer discussion. But what I want to say in that is that when we talk about law enforcement, we all watch cop shows growing up. I did, Chips and all the stuff. And, these are our heroes. That's how our society trains us, right? This is how our society that is grounded in racial disparity and racial oppression trains us to believe that the law enforcement wear the white hats, right? Well, if the goal of our public safety system is to do things like reduce crime rates, right, and reduce recidivism, well, in fact, we can measure that, right? Amazing. Look at the data. We can measure that. And we can see that more policing, more incarceration, harsher punishment, harsher penalties do not reduce crime, and they do not reduce recidivism. So it is a failed strategy that generally makes up the vast bulk of our public dollars that get spent on the local level, okay? Especially on the city level, but also on the county level. So what we have here is we have systems and investments of public dollars that are, first of all, not quantitatively, not giving us the results that they're designed to give us, right? Reduce crime, reduce recidivism. They're not doing that. They fail at that. And on top of that, we can see again quantitatively the racial disparities at every level of those systems, right? From who gets pulled over, who gets arrested, who gets charged, how much time they get, all of those things, right? So you have systems that are racist, not because there's somebody with a twirly mustache, right? I'm just talking about the statistics, right? The racial disparities are stark. So you have a system that isn't doing what it's meant to do successfully, that is taking up the bulk of our resources at the local scene, and is having these racially racist outcomes, right? So reimagine public safety and justice reinvestment is about looking at that and saying, okay, what we need to do is come up with new strategies. And we as Californians really have a duty, and I'm so proud to be a Contra Costan, seeing the mountains that we've moved in the last 5 years. It's been mind-blowing to me. We have a responsibility to innovate. We have a responsibility like any good scientist would do. You look at the data. If you're not getting the results that you want, you try something else. You track the data in the new thing that you're trying. You see if it works and it doesn't work, and you adjust along the way. So what we're calling for is investments in programs that go to the root causes of crime and recidivism, right? What are the root causes? There are things like access to mental health services. There are things like access to housing security, food security, right? Economic distribution that helps pull people out of poverty. These are the things that never end up getting really seriously funded, but these are the things that we need to explore to address crime rates and recidivism. And these are the things that we need to, not only do we need to invest in these things, but we need to take the money, literally take the money from the systems that are not having the successful outcomes, right? And are having racist outcomes instead. And we need to reduce funding for those and reallocate our money, our public dollars, to these other strategies that go to addressing the root causes of crime and of poverty and of so many of the ills that we have in our society, including things like non-police mental health response, which I know your club has just done an amazing job pushing throughout the state. And I want to thank you all for the work that you've done on that. But the work continues. So that essentially is, my vision for anti-racist action, right, for Democrats. I think what we need to be doing is we need to be focusing not on changing hearts and minds, but on looking at policies that have racially disparate outcomes and are unsuccessful in what they're intended to do, dismantling those policies, and instead introducing and putting policies in that have an anti-racist lens to ensure that we're not having those outcomes. And we need to move resources, literally money, from those systems that aren't working, and we need to invest them in innovative new systems that go to the root causes of these problems. And so there's a lot of work going on in the county on that stuff, and I'm happy to answer questions about it. But as you know, we're working on an Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice, but we don't know yet what the scope of that office is going to be. And we passed the Measure X sales tax measures, many of you also helped with, as I did as well. And the Measure X Community Advisory Board has just completed some recommendations, which will be going to the Board of Supervisors very soon, about some really innovative and exciting strategies that our community can fund. Things like guaranteed basic income pilots, things like youth and equity centers, things such as social workers for both for public defense clients as well as deportation defense clients, because that's the stage that we need to actually intervene, right? When somebody ends up being brought into the criminal system, that's our opportunity to ensure, don't wait until they're processed through the system for years and years and then try to provide services. We need to upfront figure out what's going on with that individual and their family and come up with plans for treatment and so forth. So I encourage you to look at those things. And I just wanted to have this opportunity to talk to you a little bit about what's going on the ground in terms of immigrant rights and racial justice and reimagining public safety in our community. So I'm happy to answer questions.
Wow, thank you, Ali. That was amazing. You're doing a lot more than I thought you were. You know, a lot of this of shifting the funds from the police to mental health services, there's been a lot of resolutions on that in the California Democratic Party. I think I wrote one and submitted it. And are the county supervisors, are they increasing their money to mental health services, or how do you see that fitting in?
Yeah, well, they are. They have made commitments in terms of some of the programming, including the Miles Hall non-police mental crisis response program.
But I meant like basic mental health while you're growing up. You know,
oh, yes, yes. No, that's a great point. That is actually a place that we have a lot of need. And in fact, the Measure X Community Advisory Board had made some very, very significant suggestions for really working on youth populations, specifically various populations as well. So both for mental health services and developmental help, behavioral health help for not just young people, but specifically young people from vulnerable populations and from populations that generally don't have access to robust services like many of us that are more fortunate financially can secure for our children.
If that ever comes up to the supervisors, let us know so we can be there to support that.
Well, it's funny you should say that, Brody, because it is actually going to be coming up to the supervisors in the very near future. I don't know exactly what the date will be, but once the Board of Supervisors officially gets the recommendations from the Measure X Community Advisory Board, at some point they will calendar a meeting of the Board of Supervisors to discuss the recommendations and discuss whether or not they're going to fund those recommendations or what they're going to do with those funds. And we really want to make a call out to everybody to please, look at the packet of materials. It's on the Board of Supervisors website. There's Measure X Community Advisory Board, and you can really find the report. And I'm happy to forward you the report, Brody, once it's complete, so you can distribute to the club. But we really need all hands on deck, because these issues too, this is the other thing I want to say. What's amazing, and I think there's this narrative in Contra Costa County that, in my opinion, is wrong, and I want to get your view on this. There's this idea that we're somehow like more conservative than our surrounding counties, or that, well, because we have more suburban areas, we're kind of like, we don't know if things like innovation will fly here. We don't know if we can be the ones to model new, exciting, transformational change. And that, in my experience, that is not true at all. I've been a part of and seen us in Contra Costa County move mountains. And a great example of that is the Miles Hall non-police crisis response program. And so I really am looking forward to us really all showing up because these issues are very, very popular across the board. For example, there's the Vision Act was an act that was pending in the state recently. And unfortunately, it's been made a 2-year bill, and I'm happy to talk about that if anybody wants to. But when we saw the polling was incredibly positive for the Vision Act, which what the Vision Act does in a nutshell is it prevents immigrants from being double punished in California's criminal system. So it basically says that regardless of where somebody was born, when they are done with their sentence, when they have earned their parole and their release, like anybody else, they should be allowed to be released and reintegrated to their families back into the community. But what's happening is that immigrants are double punished, because what happens is they're being handed over Now, no longer in Contra Costa County by our sheriff. He did change that policy, which is great. But at the state level, from the CDCR, they're being handed over straight to ICE. So the state CDCR is actually to the right of Sheriff Livingston on this issue, which tells you, like, kind of, again, we're not doing too bad in some ways. But when you looked at the polling, it was like 67% of Californians agreed with that. This was a UC San Diego poll, which I'm also happy to send you. And even that included 80% of respondents, including 76% of self-described conservative voters and 54% of registered Republican voters agreed or strongly agreed that regardless of what country a person was born in, they should be released from prison or jail after completing their sentences. And it goes on and on. So I say that by way of saying, when we were lobbying for this bill, however, what we got from many elected officials was this ongoing worry and this feel like, well, I'm in a purple district, so I don't know if that's going to work here, right? And that's something that we really have to flip on its head, because Contra Costa, I'm sorry, it's not purple, it's blue. Contra Costa is solidly blue. And that means we need to make sure all of our Democratic clubs are having their voices heard, and that when it comes time, when the rubber meets the road with these electeds at the end of legislative cycles, we need to make sure that it's not enough just to endorse and sponsor these bills, which, for example, the Vision Act was supported by the California Democratic Party, by the California Labor Federation, by all of the, by the Black Caucus, by the API Caucus, by the Latinx Caucus, and the list goes on. And yet when it was time for the rubber to meet the road, and some of our electeds were kind of hedging and saying, I don't know. And they were saying that partially because the police unions statewide were trying to oppose these bills, as they often do. Again, because they also have relationships with, like, Border Patrol and ICE and so forth. We didn't have a lot of backing, to be honest with you, at those times from some of our Democratic, kind of from the party or from our labor allies, from those that electeds listen to more than they listen to the activist community, particularly activists of color, particularly, immigrant rights activists, or any activists that are working in the criminal justice transformation field. So we need help.
Okay.
Sorry, I see a question is up. I talk too much. Lawyers, you know?
Oh, no, it was great. Do we have any questions? Raise your hand. No?
Yes.
I see a hand.
Oh, I'm sorry, Ellis. There you go. Yes, Ellis.
Always.
Hi, Ellis.
Earlier, hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you? Good to see you.
Part of your argument was that the purpose of the justice system was to prevent crime and reduce recidivism. I contend that there's two other purposes. One is to keep really bad actors off the street. There are hardened criminals who shouldn't be on the street. And the other one is deterrent. Many crimes would have happened if some kid didn't say, you know, I could really get my ass in trouble and wind up in prison if I did that. And it prevents them from doing that. So there seems to be some kind of mix that we need between having a prison system and having a social system that addresses the causes of criminality or them getting into the criminal system. But there seems to be some balance there. Democrats caught a lot of flack, particularly on this recall, with Gavin releasing many people from prison because of COVID. And we all remember that the biggest outbreaks were in the prisons and in the senior homes, in the retirement homes. So how do you balance that? We can't get rid of all our prisons. What are we going to do with the really hardcore Charles Mansons? We can't have Charles Mansons on the street. I know he's dead, but we can't have that kind of character on the street.
Well, so I'm glad you raised that, Ellis, because I think that there's that's another place where there's been a lot of really excellent studies on deterrence. So you mentioned two things. One is you know, keeping back bad actors off the street. And then another is deterrence. Really in the field, when I was in law school, what they taught us is those are both, those are both deterrents. One is called specific deterrence. That's the individual being locked up. You're trying to deter that individual from committing crime in the future. So you lock them up, right? And your deterrent strategy is putting them in a cage. And then there's general deterrence, which is the idea that if the penalties are bad enough, that people will think better of crime, and so crime rates will go down, right? Or that people won't do crime. Not that crime rates will go down, but that maybe they won't go up, or however you want to look at it, right? There have been tons of studies in not just the United States, but many countries that show that incarceration and penalties and increased penalties of incarceration do not have a deterrent effect and do not actually affect crime rates in terms of that general deterrence category, right? So that leaves us with the specific deterrence that you're talking about kind of like the really, really bad guys, right? That thing. And I agree with you completely. That's a challenging issue to address. What I can say is that the United States of America imprisons more people than any other country, than all other countries pretty much combined. I think there's statistics out there. I'm not sure exactly what the statistic is, but it's mind blowing, right? So we're doing this, we've been doing this experiment for generations and it doesn't work. And there are other countries that do things differently. Now, yes, every country is different and they're not all the same. But for example, you have organizations like Smart Justice, which is an organization in California that actually took a bunch of people, and I think they took some legislators too, to like Sweden, right? To look at their systems and how they work. Now, I'm not saying that it's just a one-to-one, you can do that thing or the other, but I agree with you, Ellis. I do think that we do have to ensure that our system works to keep people safe, right? But what it comes down to is that safety is the question, and the way that we've been conditioned to view public safety is in my personal experience of being in both of the mass incarceration system and the mass deportation system for decades is inaccurate, right? So first of all, police very rarely, extremely rarely, do they prevent crime, right? Like they don't show up like they do in the TV shows and like, hey, I caught you before you did something, right? Like police come afterwards, investigate and arrest, right? So the crime is already done, right? When the police get involved in 95% of the cases. That's a statistic I'm making up. I'm not basing that on, but I'm sure you could look at statistics of that if you wanted to find. And actually, Ellis, I recommend, there's an amazing organization called the Center for Policing Equity. And it's a national organization. It was founded by a social scientist named Dr. Philip Goff, Goff. Amazing scientist. And he says, he basically breaks down all this quantitative stuff that I've been talking about way more eloquently than I have. So I really recommend that you look at him, and I see that Veronica dropped that in the chat. But part of what, what we're talking about is when we say reimagine public safety, what we're saying is not just reimagine the system as it is, but reimagine what we imagine it to be, because it's not that, right? And safety for many of us that live in privilege, and I include myself in that, right? I don't have housing insecurity. I don't have food insecurity. I don't have a separated family right now and all of that stuff. Our community where we live is often policed very differently than the communities that don't have the resources that we have. So our relationship with police and the way that police interact with us tends to be very, very different. And then we watch the shows, and then we hear this, and I'm not saying you're saying this, Ellis, I'm just speaking to the group at large. There's a lot of, unfortunately, fear mongering that goes on to allow these systems to perpetuate, right? There's this feeling that like people are out to get us, and that our community is dangerous, and therefore we need police to protect us from others, right? But to me, that's prima facie a losing case, because I don't know about you guys, I want to live in a community where I love my neighbors, and I want to know that I don't want to be scared of my neighbors and my, and the community and everything. And that's not to say that we're in a place with society where there isn't crime. It's just that you can look at the determinants of crime, which tend to track to poverty, mental health issues, housing insecurity, all of these things. So why don't we at least take a shot at it, right? Like, let's experiment. We're Californians. We lead. What we do, the rest of the country does 10, 15 years from now. And Contra Costa can be at the cusp of that. So that's kind of my response to that. I think I agree with you that deterrence is another thing that people talk about, but the general deterrence aspect of it, and even the specific deterrence, those both I was getting to in terms of crime rates, right? Because deterrence, if it works, crime rates go down. If it doesn't work, crime rates go up. So that's why crime rates are kind of like the quantitative way that you measure the efficacy of deterrence, general deterrence. And then specific deterrence, the way you measure that, the efficacy, is, let's say somebody isn't locked up for their entire life and they get out, how often do they reoffend? So did our system of punishment, did what we did to them in the prison system have a meaningful impact on recidivism? So there are metrics for that, but that's kind of esoteric. I don't want to get too deep into that here, but I'm happy to talk to you about that more offline, Ellis.
Thank you for your answer.
Of course.
Any other questions? I just wanted to say, Charles Manson was probably mentally ill, extremely. And if we had better mental health services, maybe he could have been identified and, taken away and gotten help, or be in some kind of, not insane asylum, but a rehabilitation anyway. So I have one question for you, Ali. I don't know if you'll want to say anything. I don't know if have you met the candidate for the new sheriff?
I have not met him yet. No.
Oh, okay. I was wondering because we had him at our meeting. We interviewed him, and he's head of a police union. So, there is a little, anyway, I was wondering if you had met the candidate yet. Yes.
Not yet, but what I do want to say is I think that, first of all, I think it's good that we're having a contested race. I think that that's an important thing to have. I was working with the Wellstone Club on a bill that became a 2-year bill as well, on going back to the rules that how they were all the way up until 1989, where for an elected position, you didn't have to already be indoctrinated as a cop in order to get that position. But anyway, the point is, I believe that contested races are good for democracy. And I believe that too often in the elected officials that are part of our criminal punishment system, like sheriffs, like district attorneys, they end up not running, they run unopposed oftentimes. And therefore not only don't we get choice and options, but we as voters don't get the opportunity to vet candidates and really have a narrative about what we want those systems to look like and what changes we want to see. So as we're going into this kind of season of, elections, sheriff election, DA election, and so forth, those of us at the Reimagine Public Safety Contra Costa campaign and all of the groups that I mentioned are really looking forward to having some, town halls, candidate forums, where we're able to really ask the tough questions and get people to go on the record about what is their take on many of the things that we've talked about today.
You're right. Yes, I agree. That's right. I know that I think there was some legislation, state legislation, so to make it so to be a candidate for a sheriff, you didn't have to have a police background. I don't know if that passed or.
It became a 2-year bill, so we'll see what happens with it.
Yeah. Well, Ali, we've really enjoyed having you speak. It's been quite a while. I think the last time you came and spoke, it was because was with our Sheriff Livingston, and we had a great big panel discussion about getting ICE out of Contra Costa. And I think it took us a couple of years, but we
Mhm.
finally did it. So thank you, yes.
Well, I'll note they're not completely out. They're not
No.
having, they're not holding people in our jail anymore, but they're still operating in Contra Costa County. We had a client arrested, going to work by ICE just 2 weeks ago.
We heard that the sheriff puts it on a website, and then the ICE has access when the release of the immigrants, and then ICE has access to that website, and so they find out, and then they know. That's what I
Well,
heard.
that's not what happened in this circumstance, just to be clear. I
Okay.
don't want to besmirch the sheriff unnecessarily, because I do it necessarily sometimes, but
Yes.
unnecessarily isn't fair necessarily. But I will say that we have moved mountains in terms of the sheriff's office and probation and the DA's collaboration with ICE. They deserve credit for doing that, but really they didn't do it until all of us got together, including the Democratic clubs, to say, hey, we don't want this in our community. We value our immigrant neighbors, and we're standing together.
Yes, yes. Okay, yes. Well, thank you for being at our meeting, and thank you. I mean, it's good to see you again from several years ago, and I
Yes.
really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me anytime. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I just want to tell everyone that thank you for being here and being at our meeting. Hopefully we're going to try and have Nancy Skinner be our speaker next month, and we appreciate everybody's time. So thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.